Sanding is just one of those things that we have to do to have a beautiful finish, but does that mean that we have to commit to the time and pain with a sanding block? Save yourself some time as well as pain by using a Dewalt Random Orbital Sander. Hi, I'm Henry from the Serendipity Place. We provide you with extensive guides on tools as well as tips and tricks for them. That way you can master your tool knowledge and apply them to your own projects. Let's jump into today's video, which covers the Random Orbital Sander. There will be 5 main talking points throughout this video, so feel free to use the timestamp below to skip to whatever is most important for you. These points will be purposes and specific uses, basic operations, proper usage, tips and tricks, and finally, pros and cons. Alright, so let's jump into purposes and uses of the Random Orbital Sander. At this point, you've heard me say Random Orbital Sander a few times, and I do want to focus on that distinction. A Random Orbital Sander spins and vibrates as you're using it, compared to a traditional sander which only moves forwards and backwards. This multi-movement helps reduce the amount of streaks and squiggly lines compared to a traditional sander because it is constantly varying the sanding movement. With that all in mind, you'll want to use this sander when you're looking to achieve a uniform and smooth finish on a large project where the 5-inch sanding disc can really shine. Now that you know what this tool's purpose is, let's move on to basic operations. First is installing and uninstalling the battery. If you buy the kit that includes a battery, it'll come with a 5 amp hour battery like this one. To install, you'll line up the battery with the grooves on the sander, then press them together firmly until you hear a snap. To uninstall, you simply need to press the release button on the battery and pull them apart. The switch to turn on and off the sander is located here. Pressing the switch on the one side turns on the sander, while pressing the 0 turns off the sander. To adjust the orbiting speed of the sander, you'll adjust this dial here on the side of the sander. The lowest setting is 1, which is 8,000 orbits per minute, while 7 is the highest at 12,000 orbits per minute. Generally speaking, you'll want to use a lower speed for softer materials and a higher speed for harder materials. Increasing the speed also increases the rate of material removal. Replacement of the sanding disc is very simple. They use a 5-inch hook and loop sanding disc that come in a variety of grits. It only requires you to pull off the old piece and replace it with a new one. Do make sure that when you're replacing it, you're lining up the holes since this is where dust is collected. Since this sander is so effective at removing material, you'll almost always want to be using a disposable bag that came with your sander or the vacuum hose attachment. To attach either system, you will simply grab the bag that came with your sander, fit the opening over this tube on the sander, and turn it clockwise a quarter turn until you hear and feel it locking together. Unattaching is as simple as turning the hose counterclockwise, then pulling it apart. After you've taken it apart, you can now dispose of the waste inside of the bag. This sander has a consumable sanding belt that will periodically need to be replaced. To access the belt, you'll need to turn your sander face up, then remove these 4 screws on the bottom of the pad, and remove the pad. Here you can see the belt and the retainer, which you can replace if your sander requires it. Now that you've learned all the basic operations of the sander, let's move on to proper usage. Currently on the screen is how the manual recommends you to grasp the sander. Just note that you can hold it whichever way feels most comfortable to you, as long as it's a firm grip and you're holding onto the recommended areas. When sanding, make sure you're doing slow sweeping strokes along the material. Do make sure that you're also using the proper speed and grit for the project. You're also able to sand in any direction, with or against the grain. Even most angles you're able to sand. For the best results, remember to start with coarse grit and move on to finer and finer grit. If you're sanding paint, first make sure it's not lead-based. Then follow the same methodology we just went over. But make sure you take the extra precautionary steps such as wearing a respirator, having effective dust and paint collection, as well as having proper cleaning and waste disposal. The last proper usage tip will be to not press down hard while sanding. It actually slows the removal process and can make uneven sanding spots. Simply make sure you have a firm grip on the sander and lightly press it into the material. Now here are some tips and tricks that we learned over the years that can help you in your future projects. First, make sure that you are frequently dumping the disposable bag. The user manual specifically states to dump it when it's about a third full. We've noticed that when we dump it more frequently, its efficiency in dust collection is dramatically better. Tip number 2. Nearly any cylindrical shaped tube can be used as a vacuum connect, as long as you have some tape or clamps. This is especially helpful when you're trying to minimize the total amount of waste that is left around the sander. Tip number 3. Be sure to use pressurized air to clean out the sander before and after every project. When we've used these sanders for mudding, this was a must since it was getting into every little area and eventually affected how well the dust was being collected. Tip number 4. This sander works amazing for mudding as long as you are constantly moving and using an appropriate grit. However, if you spend too long on one area, press too hard, or use too coarse of grit, you can easily remove too much mud or even some pieces of drywall. The final and biggest tip is to wear gloves, especially when you're working on a bigger project. It'll save your wrists and hands from pain. Something that is heavily underestimated is how much vibration you'll absorb over the course of hours of sanding. And we've learned the hard way that not wearing gloves is a huge mistake. Alright, finally we're going to move on to pros and cons of this sander specifically. Pros. The sander is battery operated and relatively lightweight. It makes it easy to use in tight or difficult spaces. Listed now are the weights from a 1 amp hour battery all the way to a 6 amp hour battery. Its 5-inch sanding disc makes it ideal for larger projects since it can cover more surface area. The sanding discs are relatively inexpensive. Whether you're looking on Amazon, Lowe's, or Home Depot, you can usually find packs of a dozen for about $12 to $15. So now that wraps up all the pros, let's move on to the cons. The only real con is the shape of the sanding disc. Since it's a circular shape, it's not able to sand into 90-degree corners, so it will need some complementary tools. We'd recommend a multi-tool with a sanding bit or an electric sheet sander. Well, there you have it. All the details that you need to know about the Random Orbital Sander and how you can use it for your next project. Until next time, take it easy.